The laughter started before the man even reached the cafe door. It followed him across the dusty street, slipped through the open windows, and settled over the room like something everyone had grown comfortable with. His boots were covered in dried mud, his faded denim jacket was worn at the elbows, and his old pickup truck looked as though it had survived more winters than some of the people inside had lived through. Nobody knew that the quiet rancher they mocked had once walked through rooms where decisions worth millions were made. Nobody knew that the lonely man they called a failure had spent years building something far greater than wealth. And nobody, except one woman who treated him like an ordinary human being, knew that before the day was over, the entire town would discover exactly who he was. If you believe kindness still matters, that people deserve second chances, and that we should never judge someone by their appearance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more stories about compassion, dignity, and unexpected second chances. The town of Willow Creek sat between a long stretch of red hills and thousands of acres of open grassland. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, and where a person's reputation could be built or destroyed over a cup of coffee. At the far end of the valley stood an old ranch surrounded by weather-beaten fences and cottonwood trees. The ranch had once been one of the largest and most prosperous properties in the county, but for nearly 3 years its owner had lived almost like a ghost. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, and usually covered in dust before breakfast. He rarely came into town unless he needed feed, equipment, medicine, or groceries. He drove an old pickup with a cracked windshield and a dented passenger door. His clothes were practical, faded, and always stained with honest work. He did not wear expensive watches, did not boast about his property, and never corrected people when they assumed he was poor. That assumption had become the town's favorite joke. Some called him the Ghost Rancher. Others called him the Hermit. A few of the younger men laughed whenever he walked into the local cafe, saying that Daniel looked like a man who had forgotten what a shower was. Even people who had once respected him had begun treating him differently after the death of his wife. 3 years earlier, Daniel's wife, Emily, had died unexpectedly after a long illness. The loss had broken something inside him that money could never repair. She had been the person who encouraged him to speak when he was hurting, to trust people, and to remember that success meant nothing if you had nobody to share it with. After she was gone, Daniel withdrew from almost everyone. He stopped attending town gatherings. He stopped going to church dinners. He stopped answering invitations. He poured himself into the ranch because the animals needed him, the land needed him, and the work gave his mind somewhere to go when memories became too heavy. But the town did not see grief. It saw weakness. One cold morning, Daniel entered the Willow Creek Cafe carrying a small list of supplies. He walked toward the counter while several men sitting near the window watched him. Someone whispered something, and laughter followed. Daniel heard it, but he pretended not to. The waitress placed his coffee on the counter and slid a menu toward him. Before he could order breakfast, a young rancher named Travis leaned back in his chair and loudly asked whether Daniel had finally come to sell his ranch because he could no longer afford to keep the lights on. More laughter followed. Daniel slowly turned toward him. For a moment, it looked as though he might answer. Instead, he lowered his eyes, took a breath, and quietly said that he had come for coffee and breakfast. That answer only made them laugh harder. Then a woman sitting alone near the window looked up. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 36 years old and had moved to Willow Creek 6 months earlier after accepting a position at the town's small veterinary clinic. Clara was not wealthy, fashionable, or interested in impressing anyone. She wore simple clothes, kept her brown hair tied loosely behind her shoulders while working, and had a habit of noticing things other people ignored. She had noticed Daniel before. She had seen him at the feed store buying medicine for an injured horse. She had seen him helping an elderly neighbor repair a fence during a storm. She had seen him standing outside the clinic one evening holding a trembling dog while waiting for treatment. She had also noticed that whenever someone mocked him, he never fought back. Clara pushed her chair away from the table. The cafe became strangely quiet when she approached Daniel. She did not make a speech. She did not defend him dramatically. She simply picked up the menu and asked whether he wanted her to save him a seat because the counter was crowded. Daniel looked at her with surprise. He thanked her. She smiled and told him that everyone deserved a peaceful breakfast. That was all. But those few words would change both their lives. Daniel sat across from her, still confused by the kindness of a stranger. Clara did not ask about his ranch. She did not ask about his money. She did not ask why he always seemed alone. She simply talked about ordinary things, like the weather and the unusually early frost. For the first time in months, Daniel finished a meal without feeling like everyone in the room was waiting for him to leave. When Clara stood to go, she paid for her own coffee and told Daniel to have a good day. He watched her walk out. Something inside him, something that had been silent for a very long time, moved. He did not know it yet, but Clara's kindness would become the beginning of a transformation neither of them expected. Over the next several weeks, Clara and Daniel began crossing paths more often. Sometimes she saw him at the feed store. Sometimes he brought an injured animal to the clinic. Once, she found him sitting outside the veterinary office late at night with a frightened stray dog wrapped in an old blanket. Clara helped treat the animal. Daniel stayed beside it the entire time. The dog belonged to nobody, yet Daniel paid the medical bill without hesitation. Clara noticed. She asked why he had gone to so much trouble for an animal that technically was not his responsibility. Daniel simply said that being unwanted did not mean being worthless. Those words stayed with her. Their friendship grew quietly. Daniel began stopping by the clinic occasionally. Clara began accepting his offers to help around the ranch when she needed a break from town. She discovered that the man everyone considered cold was actually gentle with animals, patient with children, and surprisingly funny when he felt comfortable enough to smile. But the town continued to mock him. Then one afternoon, something happened that made Clara realize there was much more to Daniel than anyone knew. A wealthy developer named Richard Hale arrived in Willow Creek with a proposal to purchase several ranches along the valley. He spoke confidently about building a luxury resort, private homes, and a commercial center. Many townspeople became excited because the project promised jobs and money. Richard quickly became popular. He wore tailored suits, drove expensive vehicles, and knew exactly how to make people feel important. During a meeting at the town hall, Richard announced that the development could transform Willow Creek. Then he mentioned Daniel's ranch. He said the property was an eyesore at the edge of the valley and claimed Daniel would eventually be forced to sell because the ranch was no longer financially sustainable. The crowd laughed. Daniel sat quietly near the back. Clara was beside him. She looked at his face and saw something she had never seen before. Not anger. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for the land. When the meeting ended, Clara asked him what was really happening. Daniel hesitated. He finally admitted that the ranch was deeply connected to his family history. His grandfather had purchased the land decades earlier, and generations had worked there. But Daniel also revealed something else. He had been fighting to protect the valley from development for years. He believed the land's water system was fragile. The ranch sat over an underground aquifer that supplied several farms and much of the surrounding region. If the developers built too heavily, the water could become contaminated or diverted. Clara realized that Daniel was not simply protecting his property. He was protecting everyone. She asked why he had never told the town. Daniel looked toward the fields and said that people rarely listen to someone they have already decided is insignificant. Clara disagreed. She told him that perhaps the problem was not that nobody would listen, but that he had stopped trying to speak. For the first time, Daniel smiled. It was a small smile, but it carried years of sadness behind it. From that day forward, Clara helped him gather records, environmental reports, old property documents, and water studies. She discovered that Daniel had spent years paying for independent research with his own money. He had also quietly donated thousands of dollars to local farmers during drought seasons. He had helped repair school buildings. He had paid medical expenses for workers who could not afford treatment. He had never told anyone. Clara finally understood why the town's version of Daniel never made sense. They had mistaken silence for emptiness. One evening, Clara visited the ranch after a heavy storm. The sky was dark, the fields were soaked, and the wind pushed against the old barn doors. Daniel was outside checking the livestock. Clara noticed an old framed photograph hanging inside the ranch house. It showed Daniel years earlier, standing beside his wife. He looked younger, happier, almost unrecognizable. Clara understood immediately. She did not ask what happened. She simply stood beside him. Daniel eventually told her about Emily. He explained how after her death, he had felt guilty whenever he laughed. He believed that moving forward meant leaving her behind. So he stopped moving. Clara listened. She did not tell him to forget. She told him that loving someone did not require remaining broken forever. Those words reached a place inside Daniel that years of loneliness had sealed shut. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Daniel received a letter from a legal firm. The developer had filed a formal claim challenging the ranch's water rights. Richard Hale intended to force Daniel into a settlement. The town assumed Daniel would lose. People began saying that the old rancher had finally met his match. But they did not know Daniel's history. Years earlier, before returning to Willow Creek, Daniel had built and sold a successful agricultural technology company. He had made enough money to retire comfortably, but after Emily's death, he had walked away from the business world and returned to the ranch. The old pickup truck, the faded clothes, and the quiet life were not signs of poverty. They were choices. Daniel had deliberately hidden his wealth because he wanted to know who would treat him like a human being when there was nothing obvious to gain from him. He had never planned to test anyone. Life had simply taught him to be cautious. Now the truth was about to come out. The legal battle intensified. Richard brought lawyers into town. People who had laughed at Daniel suddenly wanted his attention. Old acquaintances began visiting the ranch, pretending they had always supported him. Daniel rejected every attempt to manipulate him. Clara remained beside him. She did not care about his money. In fact, when she discovered the truth, she became distant for a few days because she was afraid he might think her kindness had been motivated by his wealth. Daniel understood. He found her outside the clinic one evening and told her that she had treated him with respect long before she knew anything about his finances. That was precisely why he trusted her. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She told him that money had never been the reason she respected him. Daniel said he knew. And for the first time since Emily's death, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not feel like betrayal. The court hearing came on a rainy morning. The town hall was packed. Richard's attorneys arrived with documents, experts, and confident expressions. Daniel entered wearing the same simple dark jacket he had worn for years. People whispered. Then his attorney stood and presented the evidence. The room gradually became silent. Daniel was not merely the owner of the ranch. He was the majority shareholder of the agricultural company he had founded years earlier, a company whose technology was being used by farms across several states. His net worth was far greater than anyone in Willow Creek had imagined. But the biggest surprise came next. His environmental studies showed that the proposed resort could threaten the valley's water system. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard's project was stopped. The town was stunned. People who had mocked Daniel suddenly realized that the man they had called a lonely failure had quietly been protecting their homes, farms, and future. But Daniel did not celebrate. He simply asked the town council to preserve the valley. Then he did something nobody expected. He announced that he would use part of his fortune to establish a community foundation dedicated to water conservation, agricultural education, animal welfare, and emergency assistance for local families. The same people who had laughed at him now applauded. Daniel stood silently. Then he looked at Clara. She was smiling through tears. Months passed. Willow Creek changed. The ranch became a place where local students could learn about agriculture. The old barn was repaired and transformed into a community center. The veterinary clinic received new equipment through an anonymous donation that everyone eventually realized had come from Daniel. The town stopped calling him the lonely rancher. But Daniel never forgot the laughter. Not because he was bitter. Because it reminded him how easily people could judge what they did not understand. One autumn afternoon, Clara found Daniel sitting beneath the old cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. The fields were green again. The animals moved peacefully across the pasture. The sky stretched endlessly above them. Daniel told Clara that for years he had believed his greatest loss was the life he had shared with Emily. Now he understood that grief had taught him something he could never have learned through success. It had taught him the value of genuine kindness. Clara sat beside him. She reminded him that he had also been kind. Daniel shook his head gently. He said there had been a time when he thought wealth could protect him from loneliness. It could not. He had discovered that a person could own thousands of acres and still feel like the poorest man alive if nobody truly saw him. Clara looked toward the ranch. She said that perhaps being seen was not about being recognized by everyone. Perhaps it was about being recognized by the right person. Daniel looked at her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the cottonwood leaves. Then Daniel reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture. But for a man who had spent years building walls around his heart, it meant everything. Years later, the people of Willow Creek would still tell the story of the rancher everyone mocked. But the story was never really about money. It was about judgment. It was about loneliness. It was about the danger of assuming that someone has little value simply because they do not display their worth. And most importantly, it was about Clara, the woman who had nothing to gain from respecting a lonely man, yet chose to treat him with dignity when everyone else chose laughter. She never knew who Daniel was when she first sat beside him. She only knew that he was human. And that was enough. Sometimes kindness does not arrive with dramatic music or grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like saving someone a seat. Sometimes it is a cup of coffee shared without judgment. Sometimes it is listening to a grieving person without forcing them to explain their pain. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is carrying a story far greater than anyone could imagine. Daniel had money. He had land. He had influence. But none of those things changed the moment that mattered most. The moment that mattered was when Clara looked at him before knowing any of it and decided he deserved respect. That was the wealth he had been missing. Near the end of his life, Daniel would often walk through the ranch at sunrise and remember the years when he had believed he would always be alone. He would remember the laughter in the cafe, the judgment in the town hall, and the lonely evenings when grief had made the world feel unbearably quiet. Then he would remember Clara sitting across from him, treating him like an ordinary man. And he would smile. Because sometimes life does not send someone to rescue us from our circumstances. Sometimes it sends someone to remind us that we are still worthy of being loved. And that can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and move on. Like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us to look beyond appearances and never underestimate the power of compassion. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment, "Kindness sees what the world overlooks." If you believe every person deserves dignity, no matter how they look, how much they own, or what they are going through. Your comment may be the encouragement someone needs today. Because you never truly know what someone is carrying behind their silence. You never know how much pain is hidden behind an old jacket, a tired face, or a quiet life. And you never know when one small act of kindness might become the moment someone finally believes that life is worth beginning again. So the next time you see someone everyone else ignores, remember Daniel. Remember the lonely rancher everyone mocked. And remember the woman who simply chose to sit beside him. She did not know his wealth. She did not know his history. She did not know what he was capable of. She only knew that he deserved respect. And in the end, that simple kindness became worth more than all the money in the world.